What's going on, guys? Welcome back to your Lake Fork Guide. It's summertime. It's offshore. That means big schools of really big bass, and there may not be a better bait on planet Earth to catch a big offshore bass, an old big jig. Today we're going to break down how to do some offshore jig fishing. Today we're right here on Lake Fork, of course, guys, and Lake Fork is known, as you all know, for big bass. It's also known to be a year in, year out, and even throughout the year, great jig fishing lake. Fish will bite a jig on Lake Fork. We made some very good videos back in the wintertime fishing a jig. Springtime, you could go around flipping a jig to stumps and flooded cover when the lake's full. And in the summertime, of course, you can fish offshore jigs. Typically, most people think of those as football jigs. I like to do it a little different way. We're going to break that down for you today. But jig fishing on Lake Fork is going to be something that you can do year-round and catch some of the biggest bass that you'll ever have a chance to catch in your life if you dedicate yourself to being a jig fisherman out here. Now, this jig that I'm going to show you guys today, I mean, this exact color, everything about it, is a jig that I've been fishing since the beginning of this channel, for sure. I think the first summer we were doing the weekly videos, we were catching fish on this exact jig in this exact color. This is a 3/4 ounce hybrid jig from 6 cents, and it's in the color Crawfish Drone. The key to me is green and brown in the skirt. Green and brown is the color I want. You could have any combination. It could be a solid brown, it could be solid green. It could be like I have, is a mixture of both, but green and brown is the color of choice for your big jigs for offshore summer fishing. There are jig fish that get caught on black and blue at times out here. There's even the Mexican heather colors that have the chartreuse and purple work well out here at times. But year in, year out, throughout the summer, I know I can pick up green and brown and I can go get some bites on a big jig in that color. The main thing about fishing a jig in the summertime is I like it to be a big profile. So as you see, I've got a full skirt. I don't trim the skirt at all. Leave the skirt all the way full. I also leave a full crawl bait on my jig as well. In the wintertime, we trim everything down and make everything a little bit shorter, more compact. But we've got a full normal size crawl bait on here. You could even step up to some of the jumbo crawl baits, like I know with like the Rage series, they've got the Rage Crawl, and then they've got the Rage Lobster. I do know some guys that fish a Rage Lobster out here on the back of a jig with some success in the summertime as well. Don't be scared to have a big profile jig tied on in the summer months, especially out here at Lake Fork. So the traditional school of knowledge is to throw a football jig when you're dragging offshore structure like we're sitting on right now and like we've been fishing on Lake Fork. Yet here I am with a flipping style head in the hybrid jig. Why do I do that? Well, that's because on Lake Fork, you're almost hard pressed to find a clean bottom. You know, a football jig would really shine to me in an area where you're dragging it on the bottom. It's going to create that kind of rocking motion as you drag it across the bottom. It's also very good when you're stroking a jig, and we'll talk about that technique later. But the reality is, when you're stroking a jig, any head style is going to work, right? Any head style is going to work for stroking a jig. So the only advantage of a football head jig is some of the rocking motion you get as you slide it across a flat bottom on offshore structure. To me, that's the only advantage you have. It does hook fish very well because of the shape of the head. But if you've got a good flipping head, and one thing that's unique about this hybrid jig, the bottom of it's going to be impossible to see on camera, but there's a little bit of a curve to it. So as it slides across the bottom, it still gives me that same rocking motion that a football jig would. But yet, the one thing about Lake Fork is there is brush piles and standing timber and laydowns and rock crevices and shell beds and stuff all over the bottom. You'd be hard pressed to find a truly clean bottom on Lake Fork. When I encounter, especially the brush and the wood in Lake Fork, there's no doubt about it that this style head is going to be much more effective than a football style head. A football style head is going to get hung up in trees and brush and crevices much more often than this style head here is with the hybrid jig. So don't worry too much about having the football head. I would actually recommend, even if you're going to a different brand, say a Santone or whatever brand jig you like, I would be more prone to use the flipping style heads in 3/4 ounce or 1 ounce than I would the football style heads. And I know that goes against the grain, but that's just my opinion, my way of doing it. I find it to be more effective for me. So there's the jig, big profile jig, green and brown skirt, full crawl, flipping style head. 3/4 ounce is what I use 99% of the time. If it's windy, I will use a 1 ounce, but when I'm fishing offshore deep structure in the summer, I never go less than 3/4 ounce, ever. Ever, ever. Rod, reel, and line, pretty simple. Big rod. Get you a big, 7.5 foot heavy action rod. That's what you want. Reel, high-speed gear ratio reel. Again, we're not really moving this bait a lot with the reel handle. We're mostly moving it with the rod tip in our presentations. What I mean by that is I'm either dragging the bait or stroking the bait, something like that. I'm never just pointing the rod and reeling with the jig. That's something I don't ever really do. There's one exception to that we may or may not show you. I haven't decided how many secrets I want to give up today. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Big rod, 7.5 foot heavy, 20-pound fluorocarbon, high-speed gear ratio reel. That's all the deals. The areas that we fish are going to be the same thing we've been talking about in all of our videos. It's going to be the offshore structure areas for summertime. We've talked about this a lot lately, but it can be a point, a roadbed, a pond dam, a hump. It can be any type of elevation change. A creek channel swing even can be effective in the summertime. Anywhere that you have a drop off and there's a hard spot on the top side. That is the key that we keep talking about this year. And I'm sure y'all tired of hearing me talk about it, but if you're new to this channel, let me explain it for you. There are hard spots on this lake. There's hard spots on every lake. They are rock, shell, washed out clay. It could be any of the above. It could be all three at the same time in some areas. But the key is to find those hard spots. The reason those hard spots are so important is what causes those areas to be hard, more firm than the rest of the bottom around it, is for whatever reason, say there's a point that runs out right here in front of us, right? Well, right now that wind's blowing this way. As that wind blows that water over the crest of that point, it washes off all the silt and creates that hard spot that is right out in front of me right now. Now what that also does is that water out there is much deeper, obviously, and as it comes over this point, the plankton content in the lake is condensed as it goes over that point. So you got plankton in 40 foot of water and it goes up to 20 to 15, and now all that plankton that was in 40 is condensed down to 15 as the wind blows it across this point. It condenses the plankton. So anywhere that you find a hard spot, when the wind blows on that, it's going to condense the plankton. What eats plankton? Bait fish. What eats bait fish? Bass. You can kind of see the whole process there. Really, as bass fishermen, we spend a lot of time looking for condensed plankton is what we're looking for. We don't even realize that's what we're looking for. We're looking for bait, we're looking for bass, but they're going where the condensed plankton is on that given day. That's why today, with the wind blowing this way, this point is good. And tomorrow, when the wind blows that way, that point over there will be good. And some days you come out here to Lake Fork, you catch them real good on this point today. Tomorrow you don't catch them, well, the wind changed direction. A lot of times that's the culprit. So these hard spots are the plankton condensing areas, which turns them into the bait gathering areas, which turns them in to the dinner tables, essentially. It's where these bass come to eat. So even though you may see fish off the side of a structure and in some softer bottom areas, those fish are going to be much harder to catch because they're not there to eat. When they come to eat, they're coming to these hard spots most of the time, guys. And that's why I spend so much time concentrating on keeping my bait on these hard spots. So find you some hard spots with drop-offs close by or hopefully right next to. That's going to be the key to locating these summer offshore bass on Lake Fork. All right, guys, let's get up on the front deck and we'll show you guys how I'm fishing this bait. A few different ways to fish this bait to trigger some of these big bass on Lake Fork to bite. All right, guys, we're going to show you how to fish this jig offshore. Now, I do want to make long casts with this. Most of your offshore baits, we talked about on Carolina rig the other day. We talked about it with the swing head. Talked about it with the big perm video a few weeks back. Long casts are always important offshore. You want to stay off these fish as much as you can to keep from spooking them with your boat, but also you want to be able to present that bait as long as you can to them. So we're going to make a long cast with this old jig. Just landed. And then we're going to let it sink to the bottom. Always letting it sink all the way to the bottom before we start our retrieve. Now, I like to look for fish offshore on my electronic setup relating to the bottom, either right on the bottom or really, really close to the bottom. When I'm seeing that, my first retrieve that I'm going to go with is just going to be a slow drag. I'm going to point the rod tip down and I'm going to drag it. Pointing that rod tip down is going to allow me to feel the bottom content better. It's also going to keep the wind from blowing slack in my line, increasing the feel that I have in that way as well. But you're just going to drag it real slow along the bottom. That's going to be the first retrieve that we have. You know, the key is finding those hard spots, because again, with those hard spots, and I'll get into one here in a second. I kind of threw past it a little bit, but I'll start getting into a hard spot here in a second. That bait will stop and bounce. It'll be pop, and it just kind of clunk along the bottom as you hit that hard stuff. It'll go tum, tum, tum. And when that bait jumps like that, that is actually putting all the action that you need on the bait when it does that. And if you look at my rod tip right now real close, you can probably see it bounce here a little bit on some of these hard spots. That's not one there. here's one. I caught one right there, now it's gonna go, just released. So that bait right there just stopped for a second and then went. So it's giving that bait action on the bottom. Here's another one, and then it releases, so it just goes and just kind of hops over those contours in the bottom, those little hard spots in the bottom at rock, shell, clay, whatever it may be. Here's a good one right here. We're kind of hung up. All right, so right now I've kind of got my bait. As you can see, my rod is kind of in a crevice. See my rod? I'm bowed up right there. Bait's not going anywhere. When I run into this, I'm going to go ahead and lift and see if I can simply drag that. See, lift, drag, it hopped over. Now that bait went and dropped right back down. Again, giving that bait those subtle changes of direction, sudden changes in speed, just the little actions that are going to make a fish react and bite it. So like I said, when fish are on the bottom, this is the retrieve we're going to use. Now, if fish are not on the bottom, we got a little trick for them. It's called stroking a jig. Some of you are going to know what stroking a jig is. If you know what stroking a jig is, comment down below right now. You know about that stroking retrieve on a jig. Again, throw it out there, let it get all the way to the bottom. All right, bait's on the bottom. I'm going to drag a little bit to feel for bottom contact, and then I'm going to simply stroke the jig. Pop, pop. And I'm going to watch my slack fall. On the bottom again, pop, pop. Watch my slack fall. Follow it down. It's on the bottom, reel down, pop, pop. What that's going to do is I stroke that jig. As those fish are suspending off the bottom, it's going to allow that jig to get up in their face, and obviously that can cause a pretty serious violent reaction bite when you do this. A lot of times when you stroke it, as soon as you get done stroking it starts to fall, you're going to get a bite right then. That's why it's important when I stroke it. If you'll watch, I'm following my slack down with my rod tip. I'm not immediately dropping my rod tip, so I don't stroke it and then drop my rod tip and let it fall. That's not what I do. I stroke it and I hold my rod up and follow my slack down so that I can hopefully feel the bite, but if nothing else, I can see my slack jump when they hit it. Boy, when they do that, you just reel down and you rip on them. Same thing when they're dragging. This is the important part we talked about on the Carolina rig video the other day. But if I get a bite right now, I'm going to point my rod at that fish, feed that fish a little bit of slack. It's going to give that fish time to make sure he's got it. Then I'm going to reel up my slack. Now if I feel the fish, I'm going to set the rod, and I get my right foot behind me like this right here, and I'm going to set the hook as hard as I can to my right shoulder, and always keep the rod pointed away from the fish while I'm fighting it. So if that fish, once I get that rod up to my right shoulder, if that fish is going to be out here, if he starts going this way, I'm going to check. If he goes that way, I'm fine. I just kind of go with him, just keep the rod pointed away from him. If he goes this way, I'm going to take the rod over my head and point it this way. Now the fish is over here. The rod is always pointing away from the fish. You never, and I see so many guys do this, man. You set the hook and then they do this and they reel down and then pull. You never want that rod to go back towards the fish. Okay, he's trying to pull it that way and you're trying to keep that rod bent, because the bend in your rod is how you keep that fish hooked up. When he shakes his head and that rod's bent, he doesn't go anywhere. When he jumps and shakes, he doesn't go anywhere when that rod's bent. If that rod's up back towards him and only bent a little bit, when he shakes, he gets slack, jig comes flying out. Bad news. I wasn't sure if I was going to do this, but I guess I'll go ahead and do it. One more retrieve. It's top secret guide stuff, man. Y'all won't be telling nobody about this. Well, we told y'all last week how they bite a biffle head real good out here, and the traditional way to fish a biffle head is to point the rod down and slowly reel it, allowing the biffle head to just bang along the bottom and the bait to swing behind it. If you'll fish a jig the same way, it's a way to present a jig on a pressured lake like Fork that these bass just don't really see. Man, nobody really does this. I'm telling you, it's top secret. It's some juice right here, some top secret stuff. So if you just point your rod tip down and just extremely slowly keep that jig just barely moving, and every once in a while check, make sure you still got bottom contact, but just slowly swim that jig, bouncing off the bottom with that 3/4 ounce jig. That is a way to present a bait to bass on Lake Fork that they just don't see. And when you start presenting a traditional big fish bait like a jig to Lake Fork bass in a way they don't normally see it, a lot of times you can get fish that will not bite anything else to react to that, and you can kind of have them to yourself where other guys can't catch them, and it can create days like you just wouldn't see anywhere else. I mean, it can create home run days, and you can have some of the best days of your life doing something subtle and different, like just slow winding that jig along the bottom. Basically, you're turning that hybrid jig into a swim jig down near the bottom in offshore structures, what you're doing. All right, guys, that's how you fish the old big jig for offshore summer success here on Lake Fork and really all the lakes in this region. These techniques will work across many of our lakes in this area. Man, we thank you so much for watching. We certainly hope these tips help you catch more and bigger fish, and we'll see you next time right here on your Lake Fork Guide.